Greetings to all who are joining us today for the fourth edition of Spaceport SARABHAI's International Space Law and Policy Dialogue. I am Dr. Shreya Sansrao, Curator for Debates and Dialogues at Spaceport SARABHAI, India's first and only dedicated space think tank. The goal of our Space Law and Policy Dialogues is to look at contemporary space activities through a space law and policy lens, as well as strengthen international cooperation through exchange of ideas and perspectives. Today's dialogue focuses on space exploration and soft power, using space as a tool for diplomacy and national engagement. The dialogue will be moderated by Dr. Susmita Mohanty, the Director General of Spaceport SARABHAI. Over to you, Susmita.
Thank you, Shreya. Welcome, everyone. This is our fourth edition of a series of international dialogues and debates that we've had over the last couple of years. We inhabit very interesting times, geopolitically speaking. We are starting to see the old world order is starting to shift. Private companies are starting to play a significant role in the way we utilize space and explore space. And we're also starting to see the emergence of a space race of sorts. So this evening, we have a pretty eminent set of panelists from India and the United States. And we will be discussing how space can be leveraged for diplomacy and for national engagement. Among our panelists, we have Ambassador Arun Singh. He has had a distinguished career with the Indian Foreign Service, and he has represented India as the ambassador to the United States, Israel, and France. We have Dr. Ellen Stofan, who was formerly the chief scientist at NASA, where she advised the administrator on science programs and strategic planning. She's currently with the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. We have Jack Kirali, who is the Director of Government Relations at the Planetary Society. And we have Chethan Kumar, who is with the Times of India Group, one of India's largest news networks. And he serves as the Senior Assistant Editor for Space and Science. Welcome to the panel, everyone. So what we'll do is I will invite all of our panelists to briefly introduce themselves and share an opening statement, if they so choose to. Maybe we'll start with Ambassador Singh. Ambassador Singh, over to you.
Thanks, Susmita. So as you indicated, I have served as India's ambassador to US, France, and Israel. I've also been a member of India's National Security Advisory Board over 2021 to 2022, where I had worked on the new project for cooperation between India and the US in critical and emerging technologies, which was launched by the two national security advisors of the two countries in January this year, and has got a fair amount of traction since its launch. And I'd also served earlier, not as ambassador, but in different capacities in Russia. And US, France, Russia, and Israel are among the four very important partners for India in terms of space-related cooperation. And I think our discussion on these subjects is taking place at an opportune time, because if we just look at the US-India space cooperation, it has really got a boost over the past 1 year. There have been cooperation in the past. US, for example, had also been supportive of India and partnered in some ways when we had done Chandrayaan-1. But there was at times a mismatch because the US space program is heavily focused on technology demonstration, and India's space program was oriented towards societal benefit. So it was not easy to find a fix for cooperation. But if you see what has been agreed to since January this year, there's a whole range of activities in terms of human space flight, in terms of cooperation in commercialization of space. So there are a lot of new opportunities that are opening up. So a useful time for us to have this discussion.
Absolutely. With that, I would like to invite Dr. Ellen Stofan. Ellen, would you please introduce yourself and share your opening views?
Yes, thank you. And thank you so much for having me on this today. So I'm Ellen Stofan. I'm currently the Undersecretary for Science and Research at the Smithsonian Institution. So I oversee all of our science and research units, most relevant for this, the National Air and Space Museum, and also the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory, where we operate the Chandra X-ray telescope for NASA and the TEMPO air pollution instrument for NASA. As the former chief scientist of NASA, to me, there's nothing more important than in broadening participation in space. So through commercial companies, through more and more international endeavors, we need to explore space. We need, for me, from a science perspective, I'm a planetary scientist. I'm actually a co-investigator on the Dragonfly mission to Saturn's moon Titan. So the more people, the more organizations, the more countries we have involved in space exploration, the more science we're going to do, the more we can use this for diplomacy. And so I think this is a great conversation, and thank you for having me here today.
Wonderful. Thanks, Ellen. Over to you, Jack.
Thank you, Susmita. It's fantastic to be a part of this panel. So my name is Jack Corelli. I'm the Director of Government Relations for the Planetary Society. I've been in this role for just under a year, though involved with the Planetary Society for about a decade at this point. The Planetary Society, if you're not aware, is an organization founded by Carl Sagan in 1980, the eminent science communicator who really advocated for what we're talking about here today, and that's involving and engaging the public and partner organizations from all around the world in the exploration of the cosmos and knowing our place within it. And my role here in Washington, D.C., I'm joining you from D.C., is to talk to our legislators here in the United States and engage with the folks that are ambassadors from countries all over the world that come to the U.S. to get involved in our space program. In the world that we live in today, you cannot explore space by yourself. The world of the 1960s and 1970s, where solo government agencies were doing space exploration, is beyond. We are beyond that at this point. We live in a world where everything involves commercial partners, involves international partners, and that's the world we want to live in, right? We want to live in a world that is interconnected and that builds up communities and connects people from all over the world in the exciting world of space science and exploration. I'm excited to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack. Chethan?
Hi, thank you for having me. It's great being part of a discussion with so many eminent participants. I'm Chethan Kumar. I work with the Times of India, and I primarily write on space and science. I've been closely watching in the Indian space program for the last 13 to 14 years now. And I think we are on at a very critical juncture so far as the Indian space program goes. And while there are a lot of exciting opportunities that one can foresee in the near future, it also comes with a set of challenges that I think may not be unique to India, but certainly something that is worth addressing. And I think conversations like this would probably, if it reaches the right people, would also aid them in making decisions. So hopefully we'll be able to contribute a bit more in that direction. Thank you for having me again. Thanks.
Thanks, Chethan. So let's start off with a question which I have both for Ambassador Singh and Ellen. So how do our respective countries use diplomacy for space and space for diplomacy? Ambassador Singh.
Thanks, Susmita. So the space for diplomacy, I think, was the traditional way that we were doing it, because people were looking at cooperation on space-related activities as one more area of cooperation, and where there was some possibility of deriving mutual benefit. And once you did cooperation also in space, it was seen as a way of strengthening the bilateral relationship. You cooperate in science, you cooperate in technology, cooperate in health, and you're also cooperating in space. And with all these, we're adding different elements to the bilateral relationship. But I think what has been done in January this year is a different approach. A message given by the national security advisors of India and the US that they believe that from the national security perspective, and therefore from the diplomatic perspective, they would like to enhance cooperation between India and the US in areas of critical and emerging technologies, including in space. So that's the new message. And it has given a major boost to cooperation. So the kind of things we had never thought of earlier or imagined were possible in India-US cooperation, we are seeing now. For example, a clear message that we will cooperate in human spaceflight. And ISRO, as Department of Space astronaut, will now undergo advanced training in the US. India and US will launch a joint mission to the International Space Station in 2024. And going beyond cooperation in terms of the human spaceflight, I think there is now a new message that they will work together in terms of commercial utilization of space. Again, something that has not happened before. Partly there's increasing commercialization in terms of what can be derived from space-related technologies. But also, as you're seeing today, there is growing strength of a well-established strength in the US, in the private sector in space. A lot of things are being done by the private sector. But in India, which for a long time was essentially dominated by ISRO and Department of Space, now there is growing activity by the private sector in terms of satellites, in terms also of launches and various other activities. And from the reports that I have been seeing, there is also collaboration, established cooperation between the Indian private sector and the US private sector. So I think the message is not just government cooperation, but an attempt will be made to also bring in the private sector of the two countries to cooperate more with each other so that the both countries gain. And for example, the US has signaled that in the commercial lunar space program, they will also try and involve Indian companies in that effort. And then going from there, they're looking at new STEM talent exchanges, including in space. They have said that the NISAR, NASA ISRO synthetic aperture radar satellite, it was prepared in the US, has now come to India and will be launched from India in 2024. And that, for example, India has joined now the Multilateral Space Mission Planning Advisory Group, which is a new step, and also the International Asteroid Warning Network. US and India now also said that they would look at cooperation in terms of planetary defense. The whole set of new areas of cooperation in space have been brought in because the two countries have judged that from a diplomatic perspective, from national security perspective, it is to the mutual benefit to enhance cooperation in these areas. So that's the transformation that has happened over the past year.
So in a way, what you're saying, Ambassador Singh, is in the previous decades, when it was more of a case of space for diplomacy, this kind of a broad-ranging spectrum of cooperative areas did not emerge. And in the last couple of years, there's been this strategic shift where we're looking at space from a security lens, with a security lens. So I think this renewed friendship, in a way, with the United States is starting to manifest itself in just about everything across the board. I mean, from new space to synthetic aperture radar satellites, asteroid missions. If you recall, our first collaboration with the United States happened in 1975, when Dr. Sarabhai, the founder of our space program, signed an agreement with Thomas Paine, the then administrator of NASA, to use one of the American satellites, ATS-6, for a year to broadcast educational programs to remote villages in India. So I think we really come a long way from where it all began and where we're now headed. Ellen, can I bring you in at this point? And could you share your thoughts in the context of our nations and how space is being used for diplomacy and the other way around?
Yeah, I think if you look back over at the history of space exploration, I mean, the first instrument deployed on the moon by Apollo was actually a Swiss instrument. So space exploration has always had this diplomatic international component to it. But I think over the years, that's grown stronger and stronger, and it has this huge focus on diplomacy. When you think of the International Space Station, to me, there's no better example of how nations can cooperate for good, for future exploration, for technology development than the International Space Station. That idea that even if we don't totally get along on the ground, we can literally find higher ground where we can cooperate. And I think what I've seen as more and more countries around the world, and India is such a great example of this, become more and more capable, those partnerships just strengthen, and we can develop them for mutual benefit. And that is, I think, the most important, is this idea of exchange, of mutual benefit. And I think space diplomacy keeps growing and growing because of that. And one area I'll throw out there that we haven't talked about is the great cooperation that goes around on Earth observations. Obviously, COP28 is beginning today. And the fact that space agencies from around the world cooperate in Earth observations, have for years, is yet another way that space diplomacy helps all of us move this planet forward.
Since you brought up the human exploration angle, Ellen, I think I want to just dwell on it for a moment. Ambassador Singh, if you recall, I'm not sure what years you were the ambassador for India to the United States, but I do remember that India had been invited. It was not, I believe, an overt invitation, but I do believe there was an invitation was extended to India to come join the International Space Station program. Were you at all involved, diplomatically speaking, at that point, Ambassador Singh? And would you have any insight as to why India chose not to participate in the International Space Station program? And now that we have Gaganyaan, which is cruising along, and we've decided to send our first astronaut with the Americans. So any insight into that part of recent history, human exploration program cooperation?
No, I was not involved in the earlier decision, so I'm not fully aware of the circumstances. But then ultimately, you have to also look at your resource availability. You have to look at your priorities and what you're likely to gain from any particular cooperation. And are you ready to maximize the benefit from that? But certainly, I think now the assessment is that the kind of cooperation that is being looked at, based on what we've done, the mission to the moon, Chandrayaan 1, Chandrayaan 3, and you also, for example, the Aditya program. So given all that, I think there is a sense that India is ready to do a different level of technology partnerships, not just utilizing the facilities that are available with others. So I think that is a reflection of the fact of where the Indian space program and also capacity in the private sector has reached.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. But having personally worked for the International Space Station program between 1998 and 2000, and having, followed the Indian trajectory since my early days, I think India, in my personal view, did miss an opportunity to collaborate on the International Space Station program, because we started to work on our human space program in the early part of this millennium. When I came back to India in 2008, I had met the team in Trivandrum that had already started working towards developing a full-fledged human space program. And I think had we been part of this earlier on, we would have gotten a better understanding of things like, complex systems like life support systems, air revitalization systems, safety, survivability in microgravity, those kind of issues. But I think politically times were different. So probably the political alignment, or maybe the will within the agency in terms of, after all, the Indian Space Agency is not that big in terms of manpower. We have about 16,000 people working for ISRO. Ellen, can you give us a sense of how big is NASA in terms of the number of centers and the people working for NASA?
NASA has about 17,000 federal employees and and at least that many contractors working for it in, I think, I always forget the number. I think it's 9 centers around the country. It might be 8 plus JPL, which is a federally funded research and development center. So it's quite a large enterprise. NASA by far has the largest budget of all the space agencies, but that doesn't mean that NASA doesn't need good, strong partners. And that's why I think everyone at NASA was really excited when India signed on to the Artemis Accords. So I do think you see, which is really encouraging right in this early steps of sending humans back to the moon and then on to Mars, India being very involved along with countries from around the world, and NASA very strongly signaling, we don't want to do this alone. We want to do this as an international community.
Right. So if it is 17,000 personnel in terms of NASA employees, it's not very far off in terms of
17,000, not 70, 17,000.
17, right. So even ISRO is around 16,000. So
yeah.
In terms of the number of employees, it's pretty close, though our private industry is not as expansive as the United States one. Let's move on to talking a little bit about public perception. Jack, I'd like you to share your views on how has the American public perception of space changed over the years, from the Apollo times to the Artemis times, and how has the fact that the commercial space actors are starting to play a significant role in exploring space and utilizing space, has that affected public perception too?
Well, I think the public perception of America in space, right? The United States, our presence in space has certainly evolved over the years, but it's very much similar, right, to sort of the vision that was had at the beginning of Apollo and Gemini and Mercury, right? Of like, we are exploring space, right? Obviously, at that time, there was sort of this secondary to the public's perception, right? From the government perception, it was primarily a geopolitical tool, right? Get to the moon first, beat the Russians or the Soviet Union at the time. But the public perception, right, is that this is the next stage of our nation, of our world, is in the exploration of space, an extension of human activity, as well as human activity through robots into the solar system and beyond, right? And so that's what captured this American imagination then and continues to capture the imagination going forward. I mean, it's very interesting to see how it's evolved with commercial actors, seeing as how commercial actors have been involved since day one, right? Since 1957, when NASA was founded, commercial actors have been a part of NASA's efforts in some way, shape, or form, right? But I think the means of communication have also changed significantly, which also I think changes the perception of space. I think maybe with the advent of social media, with mass communication through traditional media platforms, you now have more ways to communicate what you as whether that's NASA as the agency or the independent organizations, the commercial actors who are providing services to NASA or to other space agencies around the world, are able to communicate the things that they're working on. So SpaceX is a prime example of an organization that has really utilized means of communication to define themselves as a brand and define their vision, specifically their chair Elon Musk's vision for human exploration in the cosmos. But that's not the only vision that there is, but it feeds into this general, I think, perception of space as this final frontier, right? This next step for humanity is understanding our place in the cosmos. The fact that things like the James Webb Space Telescope and Hubble have completely rewritten the books almost year after year since their initial first flight is a testament to just the power that space has to change our perception of the universe, right? And I think the democratization of space is a very important step forward, right? People are involved in it. It is not just governments, or at least it is not perceived as just governments. It is these commercial actors who, again, have been involved since day one, but the vision around them, the perception of commercial actors has changed also significantly. So I think the American people, and I think people around the globe, right, see space exploration as the best of us, right, as this next step for humanity, something that we can aspire to. It's no surprise that some of the biggest franchises in popular media are science fiction, right? It's Star Trek and Star Wars and Guardians of the Galaxy and all these things that evoke that same imagery of humans living, existing, and thriving in space, right? And I think that feeds into our perceptions of our space program, right? And I think there's a balancing act, I think, that policymakers then have to make of, well, this is where the people want to go. Here's where the engineering tells us what we can do. And here's what our national and international goals are. And so kind of trying to triangulate between all of those different inputs is something that policymakers have to manage. But I think overall, it is a very positive thing that people are involved and engaged. The Planetary Society, I think, has played some small role in doing that, being founded by Carl Sagan, having 50,000 members from around the world, and being involved in the decision-making processes here in the United States has been very important to shaping what our space program looks like today.
I agree with you. I think I also see from the view from India. For my generation, for example, we grew up watching Cosmos, the black and white version of Cosmos on television as school kids. And now when I look at the current generation in India, I mean, the way they perceive NASA or the way they perceive the US, the American space program, someone like Elon Musk and SpaceX is very much a part of that understanding of, how the American space program thinks about the future or where we are headed. So I think there is a major shift there, because if you look at Carl Sagan, his messaging was very philosophical, very poetic. Whereas Musk's messaging is one of conquest, one of conquering a frontier or making us an interplanetary species. So there is clearly a shift in how we from India look at how the Americans look at space. Maybe I can bring in Chethan at this point. Chethan, can you share what your thoughts are on the public perception of the American space program and the Indian space program? And just as Jack pointed out, you can also weigh in on the different media that we are now using to talk about space. So there's, just give us your views on both these aspects.
So I think, one thing I would agree with Jack when he says, the means of communication that we have today, because when I started first writing on space, let's say 2008 or 10, between that time, there was, I mean, not to say that social media is a, effective barometer to gauge public perception or anything. I still don't think that is, but it at least serves as a useful indicator to how people are looking at any topic for that matter, whether it's your politics or sport or in this case space. So there has been an increasing sense of an fondness for the Indian space program that is sort of, in my reading, emerging from this heightened sense of nationalism. Now, do we fully understand what the space program is, and is that why you have this liking for ISRO? We may need to conduct a more detailed study on that, but there is an increasing following for ISRO's programs, and they're very apparent when you look at something massive. You were giving example of how Musk is making statements. So even here, when you look at even the small bit of announcement that relates to human space flight, there is a lot of excitement and activity around it that you see when India goes to moon, for instance. But you don't hear or get the same kind of responses when you speak of, let's say, an astrosat mission or Earth observation missions. Now with NISA, because there is another bigger space player that is involved in the project, and it also is a commentary on India's current geopolitical situation, where it's able to work shoulder to shoulder, and that is as much to do with geopolitics, I think, as much as just scientists working together and ISRO and NASA wanting to collaborate. because they've known each other for a while. 6 decades is not a less time for people to understand the capabilities of each other, because they've worked closely in the past on, some programs, and also first sounding rocket, for instance. There's been a long collaboration with NASA, maybe not as strong as, let's say, India's had collaborations with France or the Soviets and then Russia.
Right.
But US has been along, maybe a small gap in between. Post Pokhran, there was a little bit of a gap until the nuke deal was signed, I suppose. But they've always been a constant player that India has collaborated with. And talking about perception, I think there is still a greater aspirational kind of a view that Indians take towards NASA, which is slowly catching up with ISRO. And it's also because ISRO, like most scientists in India at least, ISRO is quiet, working, launching, and getting back and working. They've not really had a great public outreach program that sort of puts out there what the nature of work that they're doing, or the kind of complex things that they're doing. And not even, on the applications front. Indians have watched television for a very long time, when from the site program, I think in the early 70s or 80s, to now your DTH. Indians are speaking on mobile phones. They're using computers. I mean, computers, of course, there's a lot of underwater cables, but I'm saying satellite has entered every, citizen's life today. You're able to, but I don't know if India and ISRO have been able to communicate that to even their own citizens about the kind of good applications that space brings. Disaster management is one that I can think of. People are talking about alerts and all of that, but it is not many of them know how it's happening. So I think there's a lot of scope that ISRO has in order to make its outreach better and communicate things that it's doing better. I think there's still plenty of improvement when you look at NASA. Like, I would ask you a question, the astronauts going as part of Artemis, right? Can you name me the astronauts that India is sending as part of Gaganyaan? I'll leave you with that. Thanks.
Yeah, no, I think point well taken, Chethan, because I think for the longest time, the Indian Space Research Organization has been very focused on building tech, launching tech, and building applications around tech. But in terms of communicating it to the public, I think it's only in recent years that ISRO is starting to play an active role, because I think in the truest sense of the word, I always felt ISRO was a very introverted organization when it came to public communication. Starting with Chandrayaan-1 mission in 2008, I started to see a slight shift. And now with, Chandrayaan-3, we see a lot more engagement with the public. For us, those of us who've been part of the Indian space program from the 70s, 80s and onwards, if you see, there were a few spikes. There was Kalpana Chawla going into space. There was Rakesh Sharma flying with the Russians. There was the Challenger disaster, which did sort of capture public imagination in India because that was something big. And so was the Columbia disaster. But I think in terms of starting to align their imagination with India's roadmap, that's the other thing. ISRO doesn't usually share a roadmap with the public, whereas NASA has actively shared roadmaps over the years. So maybe with this, I'll come back to Stefan, Ellen. Ellen, can you share with us a little bit about what is NASA's approach in connecting with the public about what they are doing and what they're planning to do?
Well, NASA's always had a very strong emphasis on trying to bring the public along in space exploration. And obviously at the time of Apollo, if you look back to that, they allowed reporters to actually, be pretty embedded, whether it was at the time Life magazine, National Geographic. You had this heavy public connection. People knew who the astronauts were. They knew who their families were. There was a lot of publicity. And while I still think there's strong public support in the US for the space program, you don't see that today. I bet you would find very few Americans at this point who could name a single astronaut. Whereas back I am afraid I do remember the first humans to walk on the moon. At that time, you knew who those astronauts were. But I think even today, NASA does really focus on trying to get the public to understand what it's doing, why it's doing it. You've seen a lot of communication over the last decade, really, about Artemis. And that has cut across different administrations. You know, NASA lives in a town where the politics are constantly changing, and yet you're an agency who's trying to do things on 10 to 20-year timeframes. This is true for every spacefaring nation, and certainly something obviously that Jack thinks a lot about for the US. But because of that, in the US, it's critical for NASA to get its story out to the public, have the public understand, have the decision makers in the United States understand what NASA's long-term strategy is, and not just understand what the strategy is, but understand the why. Why are we doing this? Why is it important? We're searching for life beyond Earth. We're leading in technology and exploration. We're inspiring a next generation of STEM, you know, science, technology, engineering, and math students. So having that message out, you know, to be a little cynical about it, it's not just to engage the public and make them happy, it's to ensure support, long-term support for the program.
And how does Smithsonian, now that you have you know, moved out of NASA and moved into another universe, how does Smithsonian work on, what kind of strategy does the Smithsonian have in terms of reaching out to the public and engaging them beyond just being aware or euphoric about a certain launch? How does Smithsonian do it?
Well, we really focus on that, inspiring the next generation of explorers and innovators. And there's no better way to do that than NASA. I can tell you, when I was at NASA, I would travel around the world. I came to India, I was in South Africa, the Philippines, anywhere you would go around the world. When people see that, we call it the blue meatball, that NASA symbol, you know, kids around the world get so excited about it. And you know, there's people out there today like Jeff Bezos who will say the reason he got involved in technology was because he was inspired by Apollo as a kid. We know that, we know the power. And so at the Smithsonian, we really think about how do we tell stories that are inclusive. We tell stories of space agencies around the world. We tell stories of people who look like all of us, not just some of us, to make sure that every kid who comes into the museum, whether they're a child coming from India to visit the United States, or whether they're any kid in the United States, no matter what they look like, that they see stories about how international space agencies are now part of exploring space, about how people who looked like them did amazing things that contributed to Apollo. So we're really in the inspiration business. And so frankly, following that, NASA, following what the world is doing, seeing these innovations, but seeing that now it seems more and more people can be involved, that's what inspires the next generation. And that's what the Smithsonian focuses on.
Yeah, and storytelling can be a very powerful medium in itself, isn't it? No matter what platform you use. So let's come back to Jack. Jack, you're based in DC. And you get to interface with, I believe, senators and congressmen and NASA. So tell us a bit about how things work in DC in terms of broadening their understanding, not just of the public, but also of the politicians who have to sign off on the NASA budget. So give us your insights into how things work on the Hill.
Yeah, well, I think Ellen just said it really well. NASA is the best brand that the United States has, right? It is an agency that I think transcends political boundaries, economic boundaries, geographic boundaries, whether you have a NASA center in your district or a university down the road that is using NASA funding to learn more about the Earth, about the solar system, or the worlds beyond that. It truly is something that brings people together. Right. And so when I'm interfacing with, I was just on Capitol Hill yesterday, interfacing with members of Congress, their staff, members of the administration, there is a vision, right? that human exploration of space is something worthwhile. It's something that brings people together. I like to say that if you get 100 space advocates, or if you get 100 members of Congress in a room, you have 100 different reasons to support space. Each person, right, carries with them, whether they're a policymaker, staff for a policymaker, or a member of the public, carries with them a vision for space that benefits them, that benefits society, and it's in working together on that collective vision that we come to agreement on NASA's budget and NASA's direction through what we call the authorization process. And so, you know, politics in the United States, I don't think you can escape some of the very clear signs that there are some really big divisions on major policy areas in the United States. Space is not one of them, thankfully, and hasn't really been for its entire history. It's money in districts for those that care about jobs. It is, you know, us understanding the Earth and the effect of climate change. The discovery, right, of climate change is based on NASA research. It is sending humans and being and promoting sort of strong national identity in the international community. There's any number of reasons to support space. And I think you find that on Capitol Hill. It is probably the last thing anyone will disagree on is funding for NASA. It's just finding exactly what that roadmap looks like. And as you said, Susmita, we are in our system in the United States, it's very public, right? NASA's roadmaps are very public. It's almost by design, right? We want public input. In organizations like ours at the Planetary Society, like we engage with members of the public about what that roadmap looks like, specifically as it gears toward robotic exploration, right? Primarily planetary science and astrophysics. But also what that vision looks like for human exploration, what that looks like in the realm of commercial spaceflight. How does us advancing our understanding of the cosmos also improve commercial conditions here on Earth, right? Economic conditions here on Earth. And it's sort of all part of this big story, right? That we always try to tell as space advocates, that space is for everyone, right? It's, as Ellen said, for kids that, you know, look like anybody, right? They come from every community from across the world, can be involved and inspired and part of this journey into space. Whether it's them getting in the capsule to go to the moon or to Mars, right? Onward onto Mars, beyond the moon, or they're the ones who are calling their member of Congress or their member of parliament or their space agency in their country to inform them that they are supportive of this vision of an international and collaborative space community.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, anywhere you go in the world, or anywhere I go in the world, everybody knows about NASA, right? Mm-hmm. In fact, the space narrative, if you look at the space narrative of the last century, it was, I would say, Hollywood contributed a lot to that narrative as well. I mean, India, we are a movie crazy country, and I do think movies have also shaped our perception of NASA and the American space program as much as NASA itself has, right? Now that narrative in this century, especially in the last decade and a half, I'm sitting in Singapore today, right? So when I meet people here, just about everybody knows that India landed on the moon recently. Earlier, when I used to travel, everybody thought, oh, all of the IT people come from India. That was the perception. And now just about everybody I meet when I'm traveling, even outside the country, they know that we have a space program and we landed on the moon recently. So I think there has been a shift in terms of Asian space faring countries are starting to get into this 21st century narrative, even China for that matter, right? In the eastern part of the hemisphere here, people are starting to recognize how big China is in terms of their space program. I mean, they are the only country to have landed 3 consecutive times successfully on the moon in recent years. With this, I think I'll come back to Ambassador Singh. Ambassador, tell us, how do you think has India's, the Chandrayaan mission success, what kind of an impact has it had on India's soft power as a spacefaring nation on a global stage?
So I think it's a tremendous impact, not just on the global stage, but even at home. And building on some of the comments that were made, in the US, clearly NASA has to project publicly what it is doing, because it needs popular support. It needs support in Congress, because funding is controlled by Congress. So unless they get that funding from Congress, it is difficult for them. The administration cannot just decide on its own. Now, in India's case, it is the government and the lead decision makers in government who will decide how much money should be finally allocated to ISRO or the Department of Space. And therefore, the kind of public buildup or effort in Parliament or Congress that you need in the US, you don't need in the case of India. So it will be determined by what are the priorities, what are the expectations of success, what are the other budgetary constraints that the decision makers have to keep in mind. So that's one dimension. Second, you must recall that at a time when India did not have many landmark achievements in industry and technology, India's space and nuclear programs were still seen as major achievements for the country. And they brought about independent technology development in India at a time when both our nuclear and space programs were under sanctions, and including very strict Western and US sanctions. So there was a certain amount of impact that was certainly there in the popular mind with the achievements that we were having in our space program. And I saw that, as you mentioned, even at the time of Chandrayaan-1 in 2008. And I'd just gone to the US to start working there at that time as the #2 in the embassy. And I could see that there was impact in India, there was impact in the US. They had noticed that. And there were a couple of US instruments also on Chandrayaan-1. So in the case of Chandrayaan-3, and there have been achievements between Chandrayaan-1 and Chandrayaan-3, but in the case of Chandrayaan-3, you could see that all across the country, there were people waiting anxiously to see what happens finally. And not just at the popular level, but universities, institutes of technology. Entire auditoriums and institutes of technology were filled with people waiting for the final touchdown. And all those young technologists, engineers in India who are studying will be enthused by this. And they will be enthused at participating in terms of technology development, not just in space, but in other areas. So I think with the step-by-step development of India's space program, various successes we've had, and the fact that there is a recognition that India has achieved these successes in space using what is called frugal technology. You know, each of our efforts has cost much less than a similar US effort. And I remember in 2008, when we were doing advocacy in the US, we used to point out that Chandrayaan-1 had cost less than the cost of a production of a Hollywood movie dealing with space. So with that kind of cost-effective, frugal use of technology and that we've done achievements in space, I think there has been a huge impact in perceptions in India and, of course, globally, especially with India now being the first country to have landed vehicle on the southern side of the moon. And so that has had an impact, being the, when you're the first, when you make an achievement, certainly, but when you're first to achieve something, other countries also notice. That's really a technology and capability demonstrator.
And I think talking about frugal engineering, I think even that narrative needs to, is something that India needs to engage with a little bit. I was having a conversation with a dear friend of mine who heads the office for the French Space Agency in Bangalore. And he's been in India for almost a decade now. And his view on the matter is that instead of comparing the budget of our planetary missions to Hollywood or Bollywood films, he feels that we need to elaborate on it a little more, because he's seen the way we work. And he thinks there's a very distinct difference in the methodology, in the method in which India approaches designing and launching these planetary missions. Because he thinks when, let's say, France or the United States plan a planetary mission, they approach it as if they're designing a Formula One car, whereas India approaches it as if it's designing a Jeep. So a little more pragmatic, robust, and even the turnaround times. He likes to compare the duration of I mean, how long it takes for a planetary mission to launch. In India, if you look at the Chandrayaan 1, 2, 3, and also Mangalyaan mission, it took about somewhere between 18 to 30 months from the day the budget was approved to the day we launched our mission. If you compare it to a similar mission in the United States, it takes, Ellen, correct me if I'm wrong, but somewhere between 5 to 7 years. So I think the budget side of things, I think the media oversimplifies it, is what I'm trying to say. I think ISRO and even our journalists like Chethan and his tribe, we need to tell the full story and not just compare it to movies. Chethan, maybe I'll have you weigh in a little bit about the Chandrayaan 3 mission and how you think that has impacted the Indian psyche, how it's sort of also impacted the political. We've always had unwavering political support, no matter which party is in power in Delhi. However, do you think that with the way politics works in India today, the political parties are also trying to leverage some of our successes, into their and sort of using it for their election calculus? Can you share what your thoughts are on the matter?
It's only natural that political parties do that, because see, for the last 75 years, when you look at the Indian political landscape at the national level, not getting into various states and multiple regional parties that may have existed, at the national level, you've had two large parties that have emerged since independence. One that existed pre-independence and continued to engage in active politics, and another that emerged, around the time, that liberalization was happening in the country. So you have with just two players there, and I think they're constantly in election mode, regardless of what time of the year it is, because there's one or the other election that is happening across the country at different assembly elections, and then you have the large general elections that are approaching. And Chandrayaan 3's timing couldn't have been any better for political parties, and the incumbent is I think trying to leverage, and it's only natural. You don't expect them to let go of an opportunity that has presented itself so well. And I think Chandrayaan 3's success also has been sweeter because of what happened in 2019. I think had India succeeded at its first attempt in landing a lander or a robotic instrument on the moon, I don't know how the story would have been or how it would have played out, whether it would have had currency even after 5 years for political parties to leverage. But I think the fact that it didn't happen then, and the public's viewing of Chandrayaan 3 is a lot more. I mean, there was a lot more anticipation this time around. Not that there was any less during Chandrayaan 2, but if you remember, even cricketers in this country have their houses, stoned when they lose matches, and we've heard of all of those things. But I think, by and large, almost everybody in India backed ISRO when Chandrayaan 2 had failed in 2019, and that was quite telling. Because space is a high risk, kind of a sector where the unknown unknowns are, especially when you're talking about celestial bodies landing things there or interplanetary missions. So there are a lot of challenges, and I think the Indian public, by and large, sort of reacted well in 2019. And this time also, there's been massive reaction. The fact that it happened around, Durga Puja and Diwali time, and Ganesha was around the corner. There was a lot of, public pandals in Bengal, I think, and across Maharashtra and Bangalore, where you had the LVM-3, and some of them even had the lander sort of, go around moon and come back and land. There was a lot of those projects, I think, homemade projects of Chandrayaan 3 that also made it to the public domain and engage in, with kids, especially. I think that was, if you look at it thereafter, there's been quite a bit of Chandrayaan 3 euphoria that I think the system is also continuing to create. There are life-size, full-scale models of Vikram and Pragyan, the lander and the rover, that are being put up in museums. There are pavilions of Chandrayaan-3 at the Bangalore Tech Summit, and it is in constant, news. Chandrayaan hasn't died out as yet. And coming back to frugal innovation, and I fully agree that ISRO actually doesn't oversimplify anything.
No, it's
ISRO
the
just doesn't
media.
talk about it.
I think it's the media. I never said ISRO oversimplifies. I think the media
So
tends
ISRO
to dumb it
doesn't
down to a
speak about
point.
it.
Right.
No, I think when when there's lack of information, there is scope for misinformation. So if ISRO is not going to talk about how something was achieved in X, dollars vis-a-vis a much larger project that, let's say, and also see, when after Chandrayaan 3 happened, I had done a piece comparing, or rather trying to decipher how ISRO was able to do it in such short budgets. And one thing that came out when I spoke to multiple ISRO people, a lot of them again didn't want to go on record. Uh, the thing is that, see, I don't know how NASA works, whether projects kick off after a budgetary sanction is made and the first dollar comes and lands in your bank account. But ISRO keeps working. See, ISRO, I don't know if this analogy is going to be received very well. It is not too, but ISRO works like a middle class Indian homemaker. There's always that extra bit of money in your spice box in the kitchen, which nobody knows of, that you pull off when you need to. And I think the budgeting for ISRO doesn't happen mission by mission. Like if you look at Gaganyaan today, as early as 2002, 2003, there was work going on human spaceflight program in ISRO. Madhavan Nair had announced it, almost very close to the heels of Chandrayaan 1. He had made big announcements. I remember writing about India creating, an astronaut training center like the one you have in Russia, very close to Bangalore. There was initial plans of Devnali, and this is a story I'm talking about in 2009-10.
Right.
So the official sanction and the grand announcement might have happened much later. But ISRO, over the years has always worked on projects without official sanction. And when I say projects, they work on technologies that can enable, missions, large missions, like the record time that Mangalyaan, ISRO was able to launch Mangalyaan in 6 months, they say, from the time of announcement.
14 months from the day the budget got approved to the day they launched.
Correct,
Roughly
about 14 months.
Yeah.
But a lot of it was possible because there was a lot of work going on for what should have been Chandrayaan 2 at the moment. And India wanted to get to the moon and be the first Asian country to do so and land. And for this, they had partnered with the Russians. And that deal sort of fell off.
I think you're right. And I think it's very important for someone to research that aspect of how the space missions happen, in India, from how the budgets are allocated, how the work kind of overlaps with other existing missions which have similarities in terms of, the final goals. I think someone really needs to look into that, because we've always, frugal engineering is great, but I think the real story is yet to be told as to how ISRO is able to accomplish such complex missions in such short, condensed, trajectories. So I think yeah, go ahead.
I think one last point. So I think, see, a lot of these timelines, for instance, like you were speaking about in the beginning, right? When you don't have a publicly available roadmap, the date of announcement sort of becomes the emergence of the mission, and the timeline begins from there. But you don't always know when actual work on something like that might have started, because Aditya that India launched now has been a 15-year-old mission that you could hear whispers about within ISRO. But
similarly, Chandrayaan, yes. No, you're right. Similarly, Chandrayaan, the first study was undertaken in, I believe, 1999 to see how India could engage in lunar exploration. And it was 2008 by the time, when we launched Chandrayaan 1. So you're absolutely right. I think we have about 3-4 minutes to go. So what we'll do is we'll try and wrap up with a final question for all of you. And that's around an emergence of a space race. whether or not you agree that there is a space race that's starting to shape up. And if so, what are your views on the matter? Do you see two distinct blocks? I think I'll just sort of keep it open-ended. So Ambassador Singh, can we start with you?
Well, clearly, I think there is a space race, but there has been a space race for a long time. There was between the US and Soviet Union, and then for a long time, then the US was the dominant player. But then NASA became not very relevant for a while. They were looking for a role. They didn't know what to do in space. They had no competition. So there was no push for NASA. But I think with the progress that has been happening in the Chinese space program, the US feels itself under compulsion to do more in terms of technology development in space. And of course, now the private sector has stepped in the US, looking at commercial opportunities from space. So to that extent, there's certainly competition playing out. But I think as far as India is concerned, they would be looking at their own advantage, strengthening themselves in terms of technology, strengthening the role of the Indian private sector, and see how technology development related to space can have wider societal benefit in India.
Ellen, over to you. What's your view on, is there a space race? And if so, can you sort of draw a sketch for us of the audience here?
You know, I know we're running out of time. This is probably, you know, we could have filled the whole hour with this. I think the big issue here is obviously China. But what I love and what I think is really interesting is this is so much more complex than, frankly, the fairly simplistic Apollo era space race with the US and the then Soviet Union. We have so many more players now. We've got more destinations. It's more complicated. And I think when you see something like the Artemis Accords really pushing forward, building on the Outer Space Treaty and trying to remind people, and this is my great hope, is there a race? Yes. Do we possibly have the ability to work towards more and more cooperation, not more and more competition?
Well, with that, Jack, I'll bring you in. What are your thoughts?
I think I agree with everything that's been said so far. I think there is a healthy competition, and I think it goes beyond just the return to the moon. I think it also extends into space science as well. You see a healthy amount of competition over Mars sample return, right? Both the United States and China have established that as a major goal in the next 10 years. And then the Habitable Worlds Observatory, as we call it in the United States, is another area, right? Looking for the ability to directly image exoplanets that may harbor signs of life is also an area for competition. But I think that competition is healthy, and I think it fosters an international dialogue about how nations can work together to achieve major advancements in space science and do it in a way that is sustainable, because our future is in space. And I think everyone, whether you're representing a government, a commercial entity, or the public, can agree that space is something that is for everybody. And it is going to be part of the human story invariably going forward. And so how we can do that sustainably is going into this next century is going to be a very important question for us to answer. So yes, there's competition, but it's healthy competition, and it's going to achieve great things.
Wonderful. Chethan, what are your thoughts on the space race?
I think space as one sector that has always brought adversaries together. You remember, I think Senator Bill Nelson's in India now, the NASA administrator, and he was talking yesterday about, the Russians offering a helping hand when there was a problem with the Apollo, and thereafter the International Space Station and all of that. But there's clearly two different blocks right now, and it's driven quite a bit by the economic interests of both the bloc, but the West, led by the US, particularly the US, and the Chinese, of course. So now the cooperation is not about what happens. I think the issue is not as much about how you explore space and whether or not it's put for peaceful purposes, but I think it's about who gets the big chair at the big table back here on Earth, who gets to sort of form the next set of policies that will serve at least as guidelines, if not be something that can be implemented or enforced upon. Who gets to sit and decide these guidelines? How, when you're talking about returning to Mars, launching from the moon to get to Mars, and conducting mining activities on asteroids, or looking at a more sustained habitation on moon, I think you will need boundaries to be drawn out there. And as much as people speak about cooperation in outer space, I think all that happens once something is launched. And the whole deal here is about who gets to launch there, and what are the guidelines that sort of guide you and allow you or disallow you to pursue your respective national space programs. And to that degree, I think there's a huge opportunity for India in terms of diplomacy. See, using satellites like South Asian satellite, or having take Chandrayaan 3 to the world, one has to be able to distinguish with cooperation between two agencies or two countries that are transactional, and one where there's actual diplomacy that is happening. When you speak of diplomacy, when India works on a satellite or works in the neighborhood, is India being able to influence policies within those countries, shape up their space programs like India would want them to, or be this big leader in Asia, maybe create or lead an agency, Asian Space Agency, like you have ESA. Would India want such a role? And what are the bargaining powers that you want? Is, I think, a lot of diplomacy is there, because it's economically convenient for collaborations right now that are happening, that you see. It's not as simple as, oh, we both have great space programs and let's launch things together. I don't think it's that simple. If not for the large Indian market and the kind of adversary China has turned into, the US may have been in a different position as of today. And I don't know if we would be speaking of these kind of collaborations like NISA. The space program, of course, would have projects that you work together with, but I don't know if India would be an equal partner with the US for a big science mission that the space agencies are carrying out. I think that's a lot of geopolitics has influenced these things, which may not be very apparent, but I think they play a huge role. And that is going to also dictate how China and US behave in the future. And where India stands there, I think is, I would want everybody to, think about this question. Would it, if space is so unifying, what would you think of an India and China sort of, if India jumps to this block and joins the Chinese in exploring outer space, and not partner with the other block? How would that change the scenario globally, and what would be the narrative then?
Clearly, China is the elephant in the room. But looking at what all of you've said, I do think that there is healthy competition all around in space science and space exploration, Earth observation. Even on the military side, you're starting to see alignments happen. But I do think that the future lies in collaborative efforts, whether it's Artemis or otherwise. And I think more now than ever, space diplomacy is becoming a very powerful tool to ensure that the world doesn't go off kilter. Look at the International Space Station program. Despite the Russia-Ukraine conflict, that cooperation is still ongoing. So I think space will clearly, in the years to come, play a very important role, diplomatically speaking. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you, Ambassador Singh. Ellen, wonderful to have you with us today. Jack, thanks a lot. Chethan, wonderful to have you on the panel as well.